I had some discussion this week with students about how to sort of teach classical yoga teachings, as I was presented, to like general populations. So, so I just want to say a couple things about that because I can see there's some confusion. It's funny when you work as a yoga therapist because you're thinking therapeutically so much that you can lose the thread, the yoga thread that like got you here. So just the one point I wanted to make this morning was that many of the teachings, it's certainly okay if you separate them from the languaging the way they're traditionally described. So for an example, somebody was talking about Kundalini, and usually Kundalini is talked about as a goddess, right? So maybe using those words would be confusing to somebody. However, you still have to preserve like the intent of the words of the concept. So in this example, for instance, the reason Kundalini is always talked about as a goddess is because there's a sort of reverence and respect given to it, or her from this perspective, right? Because you're talking about a goddess, whereas if you just take the goddess out of the equation and you're like, yeah, it's just a bunch of energy, you could easily make mistakes in terms of like how you manipulated it or how you chose to interact with it. So, and you're seeing a lot of that now in the yoga world, where Americans basically are pulling apart yoga teachings and making them more accessible, which is great. But then on the other hand, from my point of view, which is just mine, often people doing that aren't educated enough and they're not understanding what the original intent of those constructs were. So, if you're living in India, 1400 years ago, everyone would be sort of on the same page in terms of the respect, when someone says to the goddess, like, whoa, I better like get precise instruction on this. I better, really pay attention. I better not be too forceful. I better not mentally come at this, let's say, pranayama technique designed to move Kundalini with too much of a personal agenda, right? Because, since I'm in this culture, I understand that I have my personal agenda, but then I also have, the part of me that's connected to the not personal agenda, and that's what I'm going for. But in our culture, people don't think that way a lot of the time. So if you don't educate them on, at least at a very minimum, for instance, hey, in order to work with these kinds of techniques, you have to understand that for hundreds or possibly thousands of years, people have been working with techniques with the understanding that they're potent and must be approached in a certain way, and that way would be to not have your ego be front and center while doing that, and not think you can manipulate this energy, but rather you're in some sort of relationship with it. So that, I just wanted to bring that up because as you look at the techniques, it'd be easy as you go through the course and become a yoga therapist and sort of get out there and start teaching yoga therapy to sort of land in this place where you truly believe that everything should be like stripped down to its essentials, and then we combine science with it. There's a lot of, in yoga therapy now, there's a lot of emphasis on sort of scientific evidence-based solutions, but they of course don't take any of this into account. So while it's super helpful, it's not the only thing that's going on, because we also have a consistent stream of people working with certain techniques with a certain point of view. And point of views matter a lot. And, in the Western mind, it's perfectly acceptable to say, well, if you have a better attitude, you'll have a better outcome. That seems reasonable. But there's no difference between that statement and, if you have respect for the Kundalini goddess, you'll have a better outcome. They're both mental points of view that need to be maintained in order for the technique to work. So whether or not someone or yourself sort of buys into this, is familiar with it, believes in gods and goddesses, likes that language, doesn't like that language, that's not really the point. The point is that the techniques have only worked in a certain framework, and we don't know whether they'll work outside that framework. So from my point of view, I always try to offer the framework, even if I switch the sort of more esoteric or Hindu language around it. Still want to see if you can really sit with, well, what was the real point of this? And if you don't know, that's fine, but it's a useful investigation to do in your yoga therapy studies. Like, where was the original intent, and not just sort of throw out, well, there's a lot of cultural stuff around that, and that's silly, because it's not all silly. A lot of times, we find out later, for instance, like in the nutrition world, right, that certain combinations of foods have been sort of prescribed for years, and we chalk some of that up to old wives' tales, and then of course, you pick up the New York Times one day and you realize it's true, eating these three things together is a great idea, but 10 years ago everyone was laughing at that. So it's sort of the same thing, where you really want to see what the tradition holds for you, and that's not always easy, but it's at least worth thinking about.